Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, a couple days ago, we came out and said the Oregon Ducks might have the best wide receiver room in the country heading into 2024. A lot of Ole Miss fans in the comment section pushing back a little bit. And Dill, you dive into Ole Miss, you dive into the film last year, you talk about Juice Wells coming into this room. They might have a point. And I think it's about time we take a deep dive into this Ole Miss wide receiver room, get into the film a little bit, and Dill, talk about what makes this Ole Miss wide receiver room so special. And a very similar argument I made for that Oregon wide receiver room. I think a lot of it stands for this Ole Miss room as well, where you have multiple different wide receivers that can do a lot of different things and complement each other at a very high level, right? You have Tre Harris, who is one of the better boundary wide receivers that we see in the country. You have a guy coming in Juice Wells, who is probably one of the best wide receivers after the catch in the country. And then Jordan Watkins doesn't get enough respect for the separator and what he can do in the slot. Want to get into what these wide receivers bring to this Ole Miss offense. And, oh, yeah, you have Lane Kiffin calling the plays, Jackson Dart throwing the football, a dangerous offense. Before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and a massive shout out to the Ole Miss fans. It has truly been a blast covering this team in the transfer portal, on the high school recruiting trail. The Ole Miss fans, you guys have shown a ton of love, a ton of support to the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And Dill, I'm going to give you the T-box here, this Ole Miss wide receiver room. Before we get into the film, how we feeling?
I mean, I think what really people need to start taking note of is how good Tre Harris is. And I think, again, he spent a lot of the year injured, I feel like, and kind of just didn't really get into a rhythm towards the end of the year. But when him and Jackson Dart started to put it together in their offensive line, started to play a little bit better, and they just started to hook up more. I mean, that bowl game was about as dominant as a game you'll see from a number one wideout, especially a guy who was kind of working alone at that point where you didn't really have that clear number two target, I don't think, like you now have with Juice Wells. So I think people got to take note of him. I think when you kind of take him into account as being like tier 1 in college football, I mean, you're looking at a top play wideout.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. Like, Tre Harris was banged up for a majority of the year for Ole Miss. And again, you take on account that he was a transfer. So he was still kind of developing that chemistry. And like you said, you saw that Jackson Dart, Tre Harris connection become one of the better wide receiver quarterback connections in college football towards the end of the year. Now, let's get into Tre Harris first and talk about what he brings to the table. And again, kind of similar to how we talked about that Oregon wide receiver room. You got wide receivers that complement each other at an extremely high level, where you look at some other wide receiver rooms across the country and you got a bunch of wide receivers that do the exact same thing. And although they might be very good wide receivers, it allows this Ole Miss offense to attack opposing defenses in so many different ways. Now, let's get into Tre Harris first. And I think the first piece of film that you want to look at is when teams do not want to respect Tre Harris, he is going to win vertically down the field, right? You see LSU right here walk in this safety. The minute Jackson Dart sees this safety come in, like you know exactly where he's going. Tre Harris, whether he creates separation or not, at the catch point, one of the best wide receivers in terms of the physicality in the body control that he brings to the table. But Dill, what separates him, and I think it's easy to get caught up in the highlight reel plays, some of the simple stuff that Tre Harris does well, I think really separates him as being one of the best wide receivers you see in the country. You look at the second play. All right, you want to respect what Tre Harris can do working vertically down the field. Tre Harris can create separation. He is not just a linear wide receiver. You roll this play working at the top of your screen right now. I mean, Tre Harris being able to get in and out of his breaks, create separation, obviously has phenomenal hands. That's the type of stuff that I think separates Tre Harris. And what excites me the most going into 2024 is if you want to play on the line of scrimmage, he is going to beat you over the top. But if you want to respect what he can do vertically, he's going to be able to create separation in those short intermediate route trees as well.
And that's where it really stood out to me. Like when they missed him, they just didn't have that guy to just, well, if you want to play one-on-one on the outside, not have a safety over the top, just a guy who can over and over just punish teams. I mean, what he was doing to Penn State, like if they tried to go one-on-one and weren't playing zone or weren't keeping a safety over him, I mean, he was just winning consistently. He really does a good job getting off the line of scrimmage. He doesn't get caught in jams, does a good job working vertically, although not the fastest guy, but just really good sense of how to get on top of corners make it happen. And I think you're right. That shouldn't be like taken as he's a one-trick pony. You, again, going back to that Penn State game, working those quick slants, being open constantly, just a very good feel. And again, to me, what it really is about is Tre Harris forcing teams to basically honor him as that alpha dog one and keeping a safety on him, because it's like the same with Oregon when they had Troy Franklin. Like, you just couldn't leave him really alone because he was so adept at taking advantage of that one-on-one.
And what happens when you have a wide receiver that defenses need to kind of respect is it starts opening up a lot of different stuff for other wide receivers where until you inject one of the, I 12 months ago, I said Juice Wells was the best receiver in the SEC. And I'm not even sure if I'm backing off that. Tre Harris certainly made his argument. Juice Wells was banged up in 2022 or 2023, that is. But what you saw from him in 2022 was extremely special. Now, all right, you have Tre Harris. He's your boundary wide receiver, one of the best in the country. He's going to be working vertically, 18.3 yards per reception. Lane Kiffin, make no mistake about it, he is a space guy, right? He wants to get the football in space to his playmakers. And has Ole Miss really had a wide receiver that is as good as Juice Wells is with the football in his hands the last couple of years? I'd probably argue no. That is really what I think Juice Wells' calling card is. So if
I think you're right. The only comp I can really think of is Andre Drummond, and he was really, really good for them. A guy who, again, was kind of more that hybrid wideout, but really effective in terms of what Lane Kiffin wanted to do and had an incredible career. I just think Juice Wells probably combines more of that wide receiver element along with that ability to make plays with the ball in his hands.
And how familiar does this play look, right? Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin wants to play a lot of eye candy. You motion away from Juice Wells. You get the defense flowing the other way, and they're just going to get the ball out to Juice Wells. And what Juice Wells does, he is built like a running back, right? You're talking 6'1", 210 pounds, a thick lower half. And you see, this is really the only healthy play of we saw Juice Wells pretty much all year. And what's he do with Georgia defense? Absolutely slices through him. You see him have a really good feel, really good body control, and be able to absorb contact. Extremely dangerous with the football in his hands. And you even go back to the 2022 film where, again, very similar looks in terms of this is how you're going to see, I think, Juice Wells used in this Lane Kiffin offense, right? We're going to give the defense eye candy. We're going to get them flowing one direction, and we're going to get the ball to Juice Wells in space. And again, when Juice Wells has the football in space, how well he can maneuver through bodies, through traffic, take on contact, and take it to the house. There's not a better offensive coordinator in the country at getting the football to their playmakers in space. I said offense coordinator, not a better coach than Lane Kiffin. Juice Wells, I think, is going to fit like a glove in this Ole Miss offense.
And again, we kind of talk like those plays, and I know I said Andre Drummond's basketball play, but those type of plays, like those swings, those screens, that's where you really saw Drummond. I think what you're excited for about Juice Wells is that ability to take that and also work the middle of the field incredibly well with some of those deep overs. I mean, you kind of think what really catches your eye about Juice Wells is when they were doing that in South Carolina, and again, very much of it was predicated on motion and being able to run misdirection, but that ability to hurt you across the middle of the field when you're running some of that motion stuff. I mean, you've seen, obviously, Ole Miss use tight ends a lot to do that, use guys like Dayton Wade to do that. I mean, Juice Wells just provides a different level of ability, I think, in doing some of those things Lane Kiffin wants to do with that space and creating plays through the middle of the field.
You're looking at arguably the best wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 combination. I don't even know who's going to be wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 in this offense, but in terms of that triangle, Jackson Dart, Tre Harris, Juice Wells, I would ask college football fans to name me some better wide receiver combinations than those two. And who gets lost in the sauce a little bit is Jordan Watkins. And although he will not have the flashy plays like Tre Harris and like Juice Wells, he's going to provide a ton of value to this offense. You really saw him emerge as one of Jackson Dart's go-to guys. And what I love most about Jordan Watkins is when you have two elite boundary receivers like Tre Harris, like Juice Wells, that defenses are going to have to respect. You have a wide receiver 3 working in the slot that can create separation, like some of the best wide receivers in the country. And you get into Jordan Watkins, what he brings to the table is he's your money guy, right? When you're in those third and short, third and intermediate situations, you need a wide receiver to create separation in those short intermediate route trees. That's going to be Jordan Watkins, right? You see him working in the slot on Malachi Moore. That's a mismatch for Jordan Watkins, right? When he's on a nickel, when he's on a safety, he can create separation. And you see a big play, 3rd and 4 against Alabama on the road. Got to move the chains. Jordan Watkins, great feel for route running, creating separation, but also extremely reliable hands. How many times do you see college football wide receivers drop those kind of balls at their shoelaces? Jordan Watkins doesn't drop those balls, right? You go to the Tulane game, very similar way, where we're getting Jordan Watkins on a safety that's coming into the box. It's 4th and 1. You're down 3 on the road to Tulane. You know who they're going to because you know he's going to catch the football and create separation. You run the film on Jordan Watkins. I mean, elite short area quickness, creates separation, gets his head around, and making a catch with one hand. This is a guy that not only is reliable, but I think is a very good athlete in that short intermediate route tree and creating separation. You're not going to get as much Jordan Watkins talk because you got Juice Wells and Tre Harris on the outside. He brings a ton of value to this offense.
And frankly, you kind of want to see him working in more of that number 3 role. I feel like there were too many times where Ole Miss was getting banged up last year. He was kind of pressed into that number 1. I mean, he's probably not got the prototypical or ideal size you kind of want to see on your boundary corner or boundary receivers. I thought against Georgia, you saw some of those bigger corners be able to take advantage of that size differential. But like when you're right, when you get to work him in that slot and get him a little bit of space and not make him deal with as much press coverage in kind of those number 1 corners, that's where he really eats and can make a lot of plays for this team. So again, I think the way that they can now slot him in, bringing in Juice Wells to more of that inside role and keep him off the boundary, I think that'll really help his game. And I think give him more opportunities to make plays where last year, again, with some of the injuries and with the fact that Zachary Franklin just really didn't work out, I think he was pressed into some roles where that's not really – it's just not his game. I think when you get to play him in his role, that's just a better fit.
Totally agreed. There were times during that season where Jordan Watkins was thrusted into a position that's not really where he thrives. I think if you stay healthy, you keep Jordan Watkins in those kind of positions, that's where you're going to see him make those plays. He was 2nd in the team in first down catches for Ole Miss last year. And Dill, we highlighted just the top 3 wide receivers for this Ole Miss team. The depth is absolutely incredible, right? You talk about Deion Smith making the jump back up from the JUCO ranks. From a physical trait standpoint, I mean, I know this sounds crazy because we just talked about Tre Harris and Juice Wells. You might be looking at physically the most gifted wide receiver in this room in Deion Smith. You have another guy in Aiden Williams who's going into year 2. We expect a big jump from him, and that's not even to mention. I mean, tight ends that are some of the best in the country. Caden Prescorn, your more traditional, like very reliable tight end, can get it done in the run game, can create separation, work the middle. And then you throw in a guy like Daquan Wright, who the Ole Miss fans know I am extremely excited for. A guy that 245 pounds, runs an 11-second 100-meter dash. Very, very good speed for that size. A matchup nightmare in the passing attack. A guy that caught for 500 yards last year for Virginia Tech. That passing offense stunk out loud. And so you look at all the weapons for Ole Miss to work with. You have Lane Kiffin designing this offense, Jackson Dart at the quarterback spot. Dill, I'm already printing the shirts. Jackson Dart, sign me up for a Heisman year. Very excited about this Ole Miss offense, specifically that wide receiver room. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.